Okay, it's right about 1 o'clock. So thank you everybody for joining us for this training. We're hoping to give ourselves and all of the folks that use the Coal Board applications a little better understanding of what it means for staff to analyze the project and the applications that are coming into us. My name is Rachel Young. I am the Coal Board Officer for the Department of Commerce. Also with me is Becky Anseth. She's the Infrastructure Manager here at Community MT. And we also have Renee Lemon. She's the Division Administrator. The reason for this training is there's several reasons. At the March Coal Board meeting earlier this year, Adam Schaefer, our then Deputy Director, explained that Commerce would be doing a more detailed analysis of applications and how they do or do not fit within the statutory criteria of the program. Since many applicants were not at that meeting, we want to provide this training to again explain the changes and provide guidance to applicants. As you are aware, Commerce is statutorily required to provide staff support to the Coal Board. A large part of this support is reviewing applications and drafting staff reports to help Coal Board members in their funding decisions. Ultimately, it is the board's role to make decisions on whether or not to fund a project. With Director Osterman bringing new leadership approaches to our work at Commerce, the director's goal is to provide the best analysis of projects to the board to give the utmost confidence that Commerce is being accountable in our statutory role as staff support. So what does that mean for applicants? We're not changing anything in the application form, but we are asking applicants to more clearly show how projects fit the statutory criteria and provide supporting data, trends, and evidence. In the first part of this training, I will explain what staff is looking for. We're also adding a step to the staff's review process of applications, starting with the next application cycle. We'll be performing a completeness review and sending applicants an email outlining any missing application items. This will be a completeness only check. The deadline for submitting any missing information will be 10 days prior to the meeting, as always. The applicant will also receive a copy of the staff report as has happened in the past. The goal is to ensure the Coal Board has complete applications and adequate time for staff and the board to review those complete applications ahead of the meeting. This is in response to the board's decision at the last meeting that any applications that are not complete by 10 days prior to the meeting not be included on the agenda. We think this issue of incomplete applications is mostly due to environmental requirements for categorical exclusions. In the second part of the training, Becky Anseth will discuss environmental requirements. It is not our intention to create more work for applicants, but we need to make sure we are performing our due diligence required by statute and being accountable to the board and the state for our statutory role in this program. We are committed to working with the board, stakeholders, and applicants to make the application process as effective and efficient as possible, while also fulfilling our statutory duty. So the first thing that we'll go through is the analysis of projects against Coal Board statutory criteria. So the statute for the need section is 90-6-206, part 1A in the MCA. And the rule is 8.101.301, part 2A in the ARM, which says what assistance is required to eliminate or reduce a direct and obvious threat to the public health, safety, or welfare that has been caused as a direct result of coal development or decline. And in our guidelines, that the guidelines for this section are in page 15 of our guideline. I'm sorry, I should mention, please make sure and raise your hand if you have any questions and we'll get you answered there. So the questions in the guidelines are basically what we're looking for. Is there a serious deficiency in a basic or necessary community public facility or service? Describe that. Have serious public health or safety problems that are clearly attributable to a deficiency occurred, or are they likely to occur, such as illness, disease, outbreak, substantial property loss, environmental pollution, safety problems, hazards, health risks, and describe that. And then there's more questions. Is the entire community or a substantial percentage of the residents in the community affected by this? Is there clear documentation that the current condition of these public facilities or services violates or may potentially violate a state or federal health or a safety standard? And the last question is, does the standard that's being violated or potentially violated represent a significant threat or potential threat to public health or safety? So we thought we'd give an example of this as far as need. So if the project was a water or wastewater project, you would describe the problem. So, and then provide supporting evidence. So the problem is the wastewater facility is no longer viable for the amount of people that live here now. And then you can show census data to provide that information, to provide the supporting documentation for that. Explain how the problem is a threat to public health, safety, welfare. So you would be just explaining how that problem is affecting that community, such as if it's the water, wastewater, it's backing up, or the discharge is being poorly treated. Show how coal development or decline has caused the problem and provide supporting evidence. So if it was a case of the wastewater treatment center isn't keeping up with the population now, so then you would explain why that has happened. There was an expansion, people are moving in, more jobs, more people, therefore it's not working the way that it should anymore. Okay, the second statute is 90-6-206 1B of the MCA. It's the degree of severity of impact. And the rule for this is 8.101.301 Part 2B in the ARM. What has been the rapidity of the growth or decline and subsequent development of the problem and the number of people affected? And our program guidelines is on page 16 for this statute. Describe why the need for the expansion or improvement to the facility or public service is attributable to coal-related impacts. Name the nearest coal development area or coal using energy complex to your community on the road miles from your community. So basically, if we're using that same, the same example of the water, wastewater, how is this attributable to coal? And we kind of already answered that in the previous question, which is people are moving in because of the expansion, more jobs, more people. The system is just not able to keep up with the demand anymore. The next slide is availability of funds, and that's the next statute that we're dealing with, which is 90-6-206 Part 1C of the MCA. And the rule is 8.101.301 Part 2D of the ARM. What amounts of funds is available in light of the total requests submitted? And this is on guidelines, or excuse me, in our program guidelines, page 17. So basically, we just want to know how much do you want from the coal board, which is in the application, what's available, which applicants don't need to fill that out. Coal board staff will handle that for you. And then it says, explain why a coal impact grant is necessary to make the project feasible and affordable. What are the other proposed funding sources for the project? And if a particular proposed source of funding is not obtained, how will the applicant proceed? So those are pretty easy questions to answer, I think, for most of our applications. I think it's pretty straightforward. And the next statute is the degree of local effort, which is 90-6-206, parts 1D, part 2, part 3, part 4, part 5, part 6, all of the MCA. And the rule is 8.101.301, part 2C of the ARM. As applicable, what bonding, millage, effort, or user charges has been made in the past, those currently being made, and what effort has been made to secure funds from other sources to answer needs. And our program guidelines, page 18, talks about the millage rates, which most of you are used to filling that in. That the millage rate is higher than the average rate from the from the previous 3 years. If not, why? And then it says, describe any local efforts made to meet, efforts to meet the public facility or public service needs by providing financial contributions to the project to the extent possible, local funding, donations of land, absorbing some of the administrative costs. I think a lot of you folks are pretty used to dealing with that as well, telling us how, the in-kind assistance is going to show up, or if there has been some kind of fundraising, making sure you detail that for us in the application. And then it says, describe past operation and maintenance budgets and practices over the long term, including any reserves for repair and replacement. So we just want to be, so with the example that we used previously, the wastewater treatment center, if people are moving out, there's not as many people paying into these kinds of resources. So is that causing a problem? And if so, how much were they paying previously versus what's being paid now? And that is due to the lower, the lower amount of people using it, or the lower amount of people being able to pay for it. And this slide continues that if there's indications that the problem is not of recent origin or has developed because of inadequate operation and maintenance practices, explain the circumstances and describe the actions that management will take in the future to assure that the problem will not reoccur. And if the project involves water, wastewater, or solid waste, provide the current and projected monthly household user charges, including operation and maintenance, which is kind of what I was speaking to a second ago. It also goes into the current debt obligations of the applicant, current assets, financial accounting system, and asking if the applicant is in compliance with the auditing and annual financial reporting requirements provided for in the Montana Single Audit Act. That's important because if the applicant is having trouble with their past audits, that can hold up state funding being given to them. So even if they were awarded a grant, it might not be able to be paid out simply because of the state of Montana's accounting system. And then also if there has been audit findings in the past 5 years, have they been addressed? And the last statutory criteria is planning. The statute is 90-6-207 part 5 of the MCA. And the rule is 8.101.301 part 2E of the ARM. How does the application fit into an overall plan for the orderly management of the existing or contemplated growth or decline problems? Our program guidelines, page 20, talks about your grant request. Does it fit into an overall plan for the management of the existing or contemplated growth or decline problems related to coal impacts? We've all seen that so recently. These places like Colstrip that are used to having certain funds coming from the mines and having the energy, having that money decline. And how is there a plan for that? Have they thought that through? And if so, include that in your application so we can see all of those things. Is the project part of a greater plan, a capital improvement plan? If it's identified in other plans, or making sure that it doesn't conflict with other plans that are made. So at this point, I'd like to stop and ask if there's any questions as far as this goes. I know it's kind of quick, but I'm just trying to give you folks a better idea of what kind of information we want and need in order to make sure that we are doing our jobs correctly.
Rachel, this is Renee. I might just add something if I could.
Please, yes.
So when staff are reviewing the applications, we're really looking for the supporting information for each of these criteria. So as much as possible, providing quantitative numbers, data, trends, and evidence. So census data, revenue numbers, that kind of thing. And we've had the question come up, well, sometimes there just isn't that quantitative data available. So what do we do in that scenario? And we understand that there's not always going to be perfect data, and we're really looking for the data that's available and accessible. And if there isn't quantitative data, then providing qualitative data that's more explaining how the project relates directly to coal development. So I just wanted to add that, Rachel, just kind of hit on that point that as much as possible, we're really looking for that quantitative data. But if it's not available, just being able to clearly describe that link between your project and coal development.
Thanks so much, Renee. I don't say things as eloquently as you do, so I appreciate you jumping in and making those comments. That's exactly what I'm trying to get across here.
And then one other question, so if an attendee does have a question, should they submit it in the Q&A or the chat?
I think they can raise their hand.
Okay.
And then we get notification that there's a question.
Okay.
If that is not the case, please go ahead and type something in the chat if you have your hand up. And because I don't see that there are any questions right now, but please feel free to use the chat if the raising your hand isn't working.
And this is Becky. I'll just jump in and add a little bit to Renee's explanation. More supportive information would be helpful for the department as we are analyzing and comparing the applications we receive against one another in alignment with the criteria. And one thing that I think has come across kind of year after year as we look at proposals submitted to us is, and this is not the best thing to say, but we're here in Helena and you are in your local area. With the review teams not being on the ground, it is important for you to give thorough, detailed explanations for us to analyze and think that they weren't sitting at the Commerce staff wasn't sitting at the council meeting last week. So fill in the gaps for us so we have a stronger picture of what's happening on the ground locally, so we can make strong recommendations and solid reviews of the proposals in our support of the board and eventual funding decisions that get made by that board. I think that's one thing when putting proposals together that's important to remember at the local level. And I see that in other programs as well, not just school board. So that's just a little TA advice for grant writers out there. To really, we request you really sure you're telling us the whole story so we can make solid reviews and support the board in their decisions.
Yes, thank you, Becky. I appreciate that. I don't see that there are any other questions. I don't see anything in the chat, and I don't see any hands up. So I think we'll just keep moving through. So now I'm going to have Becky and Seth, who is the infrastructure manager, go through the environmental review for grant projects. And Becky, I'll just run the slides if that's okay.
Yes, that's perfect. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
So we're stepping into part 2 of the kind of the updated refresher training for expectations for pool board proposals, which Renee and Rachel just discussed, with kind of a fresh look at information that we might be requesting from the applicants, so we have great analysis. And part 2 of this refresher course training, I'm going to call it, because we have done specific environmental trainings off and on throughout the past 5 or 6 years, when it was determined by legal teams that MEPA, or the Montana Environmental Policy Act, Rachel, you can go to the next slide, does apply to coal board projects. And actually MEPA applies to, and I'll get to this again in a minute, any state funded project that is funded with state dollars, such as the coal board funds. So MEPA is, it's a process, it's procedure. It is in statute. It was enacted in 1971 and has had a variety of small, well, not all small, but modifications throughout the years since 1971, when it was first enacted. And the intent of the act is to ensure that the public knows about any activities that are occurring, and is there an impact that may need to be mitigated to the human environment. So first, we want to ensure that the public has opportunity to look at all relevant facts related to a project, and that they have the opportunity to participate or ask questions or contest a potential project before it moves forward. Next. So as I said, it was enacted in 1971. It's had modifications throughout the years to improve the process and ensuring that the public is well informed. And we want to be ahead of things in the ball games as far as any environmental mitigation is required. So that's really the overarching goal, is to prevent unexamined, unintended, or unwanted consequences as we improve communities' services across the state in a variety of ways. As most of the attendees know, the coal board projects have the opportunity to be quite diverse, from a water, wastewater treatment to fire equipment to provide for the local volunteer fire department. So the diversity of projects in coal board is good to look at up front, so that we don't find out too far down the road that potentially we are in a bull trout habitat, for example, where we were going to discharge treated effluent from the wastewater plant into the river. So those are the sorts of, that's an example of a type of mitigation that we want to be aware of and be able to address early on in project proposals. So here's how it applies to a coal board proposal. Coal board is state-sponsored projects. They are grants. So any funding assistance needs to have some level of MEPA review before the project activities should occur. Agency, in this case, applies directly to the board for this particular program that we're working with. So all coal board grants are subject in some way to a MEPA review. In statute, there are 3 specific levels of review. Statutorily exempt, meaning the most basic project that you may be considering. Environmental, you also might hear statutorily exempt referred to as a checklist EA. Then moving on to an environmental assessment or a full EA, which provides additional detailed investigation of any of the potential impacts that you may encounter. The third type is an environmental impact statement. Environmental impact statements we won't discuss very much today. They are for extremely complex projects with significant mitigation required in most cases, and a full environmental impact statement may take up to 3 years or longer to be cleared or approved. There's a lot of public input opportunity in an EIS, more so than in the first lesser levels of review. And it's very infrequent. I would wager I'm safe to say never has a coal board project reached the level of an environmental impact statement. Think of projects like the permits required for the Black Butte copper mine in central Montana. That level of complexity would be a full environmental impact statement. So very seldom are we going to get there. Coal board categorical exclusions. So in MEPA, and this is the most basic level of environmental review that would need to be completed. In MEPA, in the Policy Act specifically, these 5 fairly simple actions are identified within the Act. This is the level at what you're going to, at a minimum, want to prepare what I refer to as a checklist EA, just to ensure that you're considering all of the potential categories of impact. Categories of impact can be anything from air quality, riverbeds and streams, human environment, noise, dust control. So the most basic level of what I kind of referred to as a checklist EA should be completed even for a categorical exclusion to at least analyze the potential. If the answer is no to all of the potentials, then you can proceed with a really just a more simple form of the check of the environmental process. Next slide, please. So in addition, the coal board themselves specifically adopted in the arms rules that go through state statute by the department, they additionally defined other activities that may apply for a categorical exclusion determination under the board's jurisdiction. These exclusions are where we start getting into frequently submitted cold board proposals. Six really speaks, can you go back just 1 second there? 6 really speaks a lot to permitting that doesn't have specific needs that have any of the impacts, so real basic there. Anything that doesn't directly lead to construction, which we sometimes see proposals such as that. And then we do see quite a lot of, with cold board, requests to acquire equipment. So we're covered here. So that 8 is really one we see quite frequently. Now you can go on, Rachel, thank you. And 9 and 10. These examples of these projects where 8 was equipment purchases, 9 and 10 are going to be examples of replacing leaky water lines, but not disturbing any undisturbed terrain. It's already been disturbed. We were just taking old pipe out, putting new pipe in. So the footprint of the water system isn't changing. We're really just doing replacement of existing facilities, or what would be another example? Replacing a floor in a building that was insufficiently supported to hold up, let's say, the boiler system for a courthouse, or the boiler system itself would be an in and out replacement if an entity, a local government, and I'm just trying to think of a few examples, had a boiler or an AC system that was no longer functional, and to continue to provide services to the local populace in an effective way, they need that building to be air conditioned or heated. One other example of a replacement type activity might be a control panel or booster pumps within a lift or booster station for your water or wastewater system. So those are the types of projects to think of when we're looking at replacement of existing facilities that don't change the footprint. The board also has the authority to change at its opinion that a project may need more environmental review than what the applicant thought. So they may say, we, the board, looked at the checklist DA that you provided, and there's also a whole bunch of local controversy or letters of non-support. And so significant public controversy, we do think there's significant potential for significant effect. So they would be able to say, yeah, your exclusion, but we disagree with you. We want you to do further environmental review. Are there any questions from the attendees? Seeing none, we can go to the next slide. So that discussion was all for, oh, Harry has a question.
Hello.
Hello, Perry.
Hi. Harry's here, but this is George. So, you know, in the categorical exclusion, is there a number of days that have to, like, you know, like one of the levels of the EA or is 30 days? do we have to do that for a categorical exclusion? Do we have to, is it 30 days or can it just be the public comment period we have at our own board meetings?
Correct. And that, I'm going to answer your question right here on this slide, and I believe I speak to it a little bit further in the future when I talk about public participation. So if anyone didn't hear Perry's question, or I believe George was with him as well, it was related to how long does the public opportunity or public comment period have to be, especially if it's a categorically excluded project. And the answer, even though I have the first comment related to that, specific on this environmental assessment slide, is the same for categorical exclusions and for environmental assessments. So MEPA does not define or prescribe a number of days. MEPA, the policy leaves that decision at the local level to determine how complex is the project. Do we expect public controversy or not? So if you have a very straightforward project, your opportunity for public participation of the checklist DA or the draft DA, which as I mentioned would be a little more detailed, could be 5 days. If you think the project has more wide variety of activities within it, you're going to fix the lift station plus some water lines plus a discharge pipe plus potentially a lagoon liner. You're getting into more types of activities in the project. There you may locally decide we want 30 days. That one we might get some comments on. So the length of public review is not prescribed specifically. That is up to the applicant, the local government, to make that determination. So I hope that answers your question specifically. And then I'll jump back to the environmental assessment. So when we went over the categorical exclusions, as I mentioned, that is it really is just a checklist to say yes or no, we fit under this description of categorical exclusion in all of these content areas. If we're going up to the level of an environmental assessment, then when we completed the environmental checklist, which has, I mentioned some potential categories on it to say, anything rivers and streams, solid waste, energy resources, land use, is there any employment that it may affect? Is there housing conditions the project may affect? Geologic features go into the physical environment. Are there any endangered species that we might be impacting? Wildlife or habitats, fish and sage grouse, is there any potential impacts to them? Those are some of the topics in the checklist that you want to be considering either at the CADEX level. And then if you have a lot of, yes, potentially I will impact any of those example categories, there's lots more, then we're going to want to step up to the level of a full environmental assessment, which is going to include additional source documentation, potentially some mapping. How did I determine that sage grouse is not in the project area? How did I determine that plants or wildlife are not going to be impacted by the location of, or they haven't been impacted by the current lagoon location, and we are just going to be rehabilitating those lagoons. So EA level steps up to provide additional types of analysis, then step into the public review and comment period. So for the EA, we're looking at the checklist with all of those topic areas. In the current position of the department, we do have some analysis of MEPA occurring right now to ensure our compliance is on target. Currently, we also require what's called the environmental review form, which basically it is 6 questions that basically summarizes the checklist responses, and it is signed off on by the local official to indicate they agree with the assessment. I say signed off on by the local official. Frequently what we see is consultants completing most of the environmental process. If the local government completes the process on their own, meaning the checklist and the environmental review form, that's great, but you're taking on a different role of responsibility. And in most cases, we see it handed down to a consultant. Okay. So here's a little bit that what would definitely kick you up to an environmental assessment. Public controversy. We are going to impact, for example, the river that there's bull trout in, or any cultural resources, sensitive environment, endangered species. So if you go through the checklist and you answer a yes to those types of categories, that's where we want to do the more rigorous assessment to ensure that we have mitigation plans in place and any of those potential impacts have been thoroughly thought through how they're going to be responded to. Okay. So this is really starting the public process. And this is where we offered, and I feel like we might have lost one slide in here. Maybe jump forward for me. Maybe they just got out of order. One more. Okay, you can back up. Sorry. So this is where I feel like I'm jumping a little tiny bit ahead here, but in between what I was speaking to on the last slide, the environmental assessment checklist and the environmental review form, that's when we want to go out and notice the public that they may review the 2 documents that were prepared, the checklist and the review form, and ask questions, present comments on any of the initial assessment or the initial analysis of potential impacts made by either the consultant or the local government. So this is where we say at public, we're going to offer you for X number of days, depending on the complexity of the project, to look at this documentation. Then we're going to have a properly noticed public meeting, and we will accept the process that's been done and agree that all impacts have been considered. 2, we'll say, nope, I think we missed something here. We still need to do some more work. Or 3, go up to an environmental impact statement, which is very unlikely. Okay. So this is just a quick list of some of, I mentioned several types of things that you're going to be considering as you go through the checklist. This is just a quick list of other resources, depending on your project type, that you may want to check in with if you're impacted, if you're potentially working in any of these areas with your project that may have permitting, any restrictions, any additional questions to answer. That's just a quick example list of other entities to contact. So I said I'm really going to kind of go quick over the EIS. Very infrequently will a Colbert project get to this, even in some of the department's larger programs that fund similar but much more complex projects than we frequently see with Colbert. Very seldom get to an EIS. And if you do get to an EIS, you will certainly be in conversation with the department at a high level. Okay. So here's where we get into the public meeting piece. So there's really 4 pieces that the department is currently requiring, the public meeting being the third. I've spoken to a checklist. I've spoken to an environmental review form, and then we're going to speak to the public meeting and the importance of the opportunity for local residents to consider what's going on. They have an yep, go back just 1 second. They have an opportunity. Level and type depends on how much interest, how challenging of a project. Environmental documents can be reviewed at any time. So even if we pass the meeting date, the public hearing date and time that says we, the local government, agree that this is an EA, you've done a thorough analysis, we're going to move on. The public can still request those documents for up to 30 days if they still have questions about the project. So your meeting date and time, this is one thing that's important here, that it says opportunity to review applicable documents must be advertised. That can be a legal ad in your local paper, if that's what local practice is. That can be flyers posted around town that says, hey, public, we are going to have a meeting or we've completed some environmental review documents for a water project. We're giving you the opportunity to review those documents, and we're also going to have a meeting to discuss those documents. So it's important that that notice is given and advertised to the public so that they're made aware that they can ask questions, they can express concerns with any proposal, and their voice can be heard. Okay. Then if all of that goes on, occasionally we'll see a change of scope. There's a whole lot of things that can happen out there. Lawsuits can be filed. I don't know. There's a whole world of examples. But any significant change to the original proposal, if we should reassess the environmental process to see, I'm trying to think of a good example. If a lift station was proposed, let's say on the east side of town on Street L in that general area, and then as final design proceeded, it was determined that the lift station, because of other valves, connections, pieces of the system that are going to pump to that lift station, it needs to be moved up to a totally different northeast area of town rather than straight east out of town. Was that new area considered in the initial environmental review? If not, we need to update those environmental process documents. That would be an example of a significant change. And then again, public processes, any updated documents. We don't really see changes to a project happen very frequently in Colbert. So here's what we're looking for in the application materials. Obviously, we start with the checklist, the checklist, which could be either the checklist EA, your basic analysis to determine if you fall into an exclusion, or the draft EA with a little more detailed analysis provided. We're looking for those two documents, plus how was the public noticed that they could review, how to get copies of the documents, any comments received, documentation of your meeting, that they were again made aware they could comment. And then moving on to the actual decision, which can come in the form of either a resolution signed off on at the public meeting, or can come in the form of meeting minutes that demonstrate discussion of the environmental review documents, and that the council or commission or board, whatever type of entity local government is applying, all voted on and agreed to the level of review determined by the local government or the consultant, whoever was putting the paperwork together. So here again, just kind of the pieces. One other option that the board has is they can determine, they may decide which projects are categorically excluded from MEPA. And as I said up early on in the presentation, they've kind of expanded, made their additional categories that may apply for that exclusion. So that's what that first consideration is speaking to, where they've kind of expanded just MEPA and said, we also think these for our particular board. And that has been accepted through state processes and under state law. The other important thing to remember is that it's the responsibility of the local government or the applicant, typically along with their consultants, to go through the process. We Commerce staff will review those documents and make comments as to whether we believe they are sufficient to meet MEPA compliance, or if they're missing a step. That's our only responsibility. Your responsibility as the local government to actually do the paperwork to get to that point of MEPA compliance. Okay. So this I already mentioned. Generally, your process is complete at the end of your public hearing, but any resident could still comment for 30 days. They could bring a legal challenge. Probably pretty unlikely on a coal board proposal, but it is out there in state law. And procedural processes are followed. Public was involved in the whole review process. Then we can move on to presenting that proposal to the board. They can make a funding decision. If those grants are awarded, then staff will move forward to contracting and proceeding with project activities. Okay. That's what we have for hopefully a beneficial refresher or training on where the department is, on how we're analyzing application materials and information presented, as well as how we're looking at the environmental review process and the required components at this time. Rachel or Renee, do you have anything to add?
This is Renee. Becky, you already noted this, but I just wanted to say it one more time, that we are looking at the requirements for categorical exclusions. And so there may be upcoming changes. We're trying to make this process, this whole application process, as efficient as possible and as easy as possible for all of our applicants. So more to come on that.
I don't have anything to add on MEPA. Thank you, Becky. I sure appreciate that.
Sure. Any more questions from anyone? And Teresa has her hand up. I will. Here we go. Teresa, what's your question?
Just real quickly, is there a way or a place we'll be able to download your PowerPoint?
Yes, it will be posted to the Coal Board website, and it is also recording. The recording will be out there in a few days as well.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? I don't see any. As Becky just mentioned, we will be, this training has been recorded and we will be posting it on the website. So anyone can look at it at any time, which we are hoping will be very helpful for you folks. Please feel free to contact staff with any questions. Again, I'm Rachel Young. I'm the board officer, so I'm always available to answer questions. And the next application deadline is October 24th, and that is for the December 8th Coal Board meeting. So if you have questions in between times, or if there's anything I can help you with as far as this presentation or any other questions, please feel free to contact us and we'll be happy to help you. Thank you all for your time. Thank you, Renee, for your questions and additions to this training. Also, thank you, Becky and Seth, for all of your knowledge on MEPA and those requirements. I sure appreciate your help. And I think that does it for today. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Rachel.